Okay, well, welcome everybody to Solar Noon Tuesday. And as per normal, what I'll do is I'll go through the news of the solar for this week. Then I've got a whole bunch of announcements, webinars, things like that, and then we'll jump into the topic. But at some point, those of you who are online right now, if you want to speak up at any point, I'm happy to be interrupted. So this is the news for the week of April 10th. And one of the announcements was that interconnection applications on the US grid have soared in 2022. It's led to a really deep backlog of these applications, and this is quite concerning. As of now, there are about 1,900 gigawatts of renewable energy systems that are waiting to go online, just waiting for the regulatory go-ahead through this interconnection agreement process. That of those, 947 gigawatts are solar, 670 are storage. A lot of these are hybrid systems where it's storage and solar co-located, about 30 gigawatts wind, and less than 100 gigawatts of natural gas. So basically what that's telling us is that of all of the applications that have gotten to the point where they want to be connected to the grid, 95% of these are renewable energy, and only 5% or less is natural gas. There's no coal, no nuclear, none of that in the pipeline. Now, what's happened is many of the regional transmission operators, the RTOs, have just stopped taking applications. In fact, CAISO, C-A-I-S-O, which is the operator for California, refused to take any interconnection applications in 2022. PJM, which operates in the Midwest, they are between really New York and Chicago area. They're saying they're not going to look at the applications until 2025. So 3 years before they'll even take a look at the applications that were received in 2022. To give you a sense of how this might slow down the transition to renewable energy, currently the United States has about 142 gigawatts of solar installed. There are now about 650 gigawatts waiting to be installed if they can just get approval. So 4 times the amount that currently exists is in the pipeline. So this is a big concern, and we've got to figure out at a governmental level how to work through this process so that we don't delay the transition to renewables. Speaking of RTOs, the regional transmission operators, they have issued some dire warnings about the state of the nation's grid. Now, what they're saying is that about 141 million residents, and this diagram here shows where those residents are located, primarily in the Midwest, up in New England, California, and North Carolina. They're at risk of prolonged power outages due to the increasingly occurring severe weather events. Essentially, what they're saying is the grid has been pushed to its capacity, and there is no reserve to deal with any kind of unusual surges in demand or disruption just to the infrastructure. They're even anticipating over the summer, when higher energy uses are in place because of air conditioning, we might see large outages or rolling blackouts because of the fact that the grid is hanging by a thread there as far as generating capacity. Those two stories, the fact the interconnections are not getting processed fast enough and that the grid needs more power, not unrelated. If we can get these things online faster, then you've got more of a reserve to deal with the increasing severe weather. Mytrex, which is a Canadian solar manufacturing company, has announced that they plan to open up a manufacturing plant in the United States, a 2.5 gigawatt, very large manufacturing facility. They haven't said where in the United States it's going to be located, but they do say they're intending to hire about 250 people there if they can find them. Now, Mytrex specializes in colored solar panels, basically solar panels that are designed to blend in with the roof. This example there is one that sort of mimics a shingle or slate type texture there. So that's just one example of how all of these companies are opening up solar manufacturing as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed last year. And speaking of that, Cornell University just completed a study where they project that by moving restoring the domestic manufacturing of solar product here, if we have 100% domestically manufactured solar pipeline by 2035, they're saying that it could cut U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by 30% over 2020 levels. And it could cut electrical consumption by about 13%. Now, these greenhouse gas savings are essentially because you're not having to transmit or transport solar panels halfway around the world, but also that by eliminating those supply line constraints that we're experiencing now, these systems will be more available and there will be shorter install or wait list for the amount of time to get the product, which will then again accelerate the transition. Hopefully, we see this accelerating. We see the permitting for the larger products decelerating that process. So that by putting more and more solar in, we'll cut those greenhouse gas emissions. The US is the second largest emitter of greenhouse gas worldwide, only behind China. The US, China, and India combined account for about 42.5% of all of the greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. A team at UCLA has just unveiled, they've been working on a project of making semi-transparent organic solar panels to be used on top of greenhouses. This picture is a prototype here of something that they've been working with. Now, organic solar panels are basically made from carbon rather than with silicon. And they do have a number of advantages. One is that they're low cost, they're lightweight, they're flexible, you know, sort of a amorphous type solar panel. The downside, and why they've not really become commercially available, is that they tend to degrade in sunlight, which is bad for solar panels. But they have found that by adding an antioxidant material to the process of manufacturing, they've really been able to stabilize those panels so that they don't degrade much more than a silicon-based solar panel. Plus, these semi-transparent panels that are used in agriculture, in this case in a greenhouse, do block ultraviolet and infrared light, which makes the plants grow better than just plain glass. So we might see these kind of panels being put in an agrivoltaic situation where we want to have plant growth underneath the solar array. And then another cool innovation that I saw as I was researching all of this is a Swiss startup company called Sunways has announced that they're looking at installing solar panels along railroad tracks, along train tracks. They just lay in there between the rails, and actually they're pre-assembled and they're installed with a special train that goes over the rails and just lays these panels out between the rails like you would lay carpeting or roll out the red carpet, so to speak. Then they can equip other trains with brushes that will clean these panels as they travel over them. And because these railway systems have to be maintained periodically, they can roll them up, you know, remove them pretty much just as easily as they lay them down, and remove them during maintenance periods on these rails. So kind of an interesting innovation, a place that's level, accessible to sun, and not utilized for anything else at the moment. They do say that there's over 1 million kilometers of railroad track worldwide that could be used for solar. And that's the news. Some good news, bad news, you know, delays in interconnection, but a lot of innovation in solar. So
Hey,
anybody
Jay.
have anything else? Yeah.
Hi, Jay. I'm just curious. I see the train rolling out the solar panels, but how do you wire them up?
I think the wiring is part of the already done assembly. These things just roll out with some sort of flexible racking system, and they're already interconnected. So they're in that boxcar, and then they're just rolled out underneath as a full assembly, and then they'd have to connect them in somewhere along the electric system that I suspect the railway has available, or some sort of interconnection point.
Okay, cool. And then one other quick one was that graphic you had with the infrastructure and how bad it is. I think Ohio was gray. What does the gray mean?
The gray just, I think it meant that we were the gray was just telling PJ&M. Yeah, they were just, all of those different colors in that graphic were reports from the different regional transmission authorities. So the part of Ohio you saw is part that was under subject for we may have prolonged blackouts.
Okay.
But when you dig deeper into that article, they were talking about different reasons for the different blackouts. It could be tornado, severe storms, hurricanes, ice in Texas, for example. So they had a whole bunch of reasons, but they were just sort of saying these were the regional authorities that were, and the areas they considered to be at risk. Okay, anybody else have any questions? Or even Eric, you can have more questions if you want. I didn't want to say so. All right, well, let me jump into the announcements. If things occur to you, just jump on in. Some of these webinars that are coming up, we've got this one is available online if you can search YouTube or search under Renvu. They've got the energy storage market series that talks about the solar and home grid energy system. So that's available. It's a seminar that is past that they recorded. On April 12th, which is tomorrow from this case, we have a seminar about management of assets on larger systems. So that's available. Then this particular one, EV charging management, this is on the 12th also, tomorrow. Business management for workshops. And then the 12th, again, tomorrow's big day for webinars. From Wood Mackenzie. This one is navigating U.S. energy incentives and tax credits and the like. I did just get an email today saying you're getting close to the deadline for registering. So I'd follow up on that if you want to attend very quickly. Then there's also some screenings still going on of how to power a city movie. This is offered by Solar United Neighbors. So that might be something you're interested through April 17th through the 23rd. They're having a screening. Then it's followed up by, I think the movie makers are going to have a question and answer type thing. That's also out there if you want to check on that. On April 18th at 2 p.m., these are all Eastern Daylight Times, Navigating the Solar Structure webinar coming up from Solar Power World. Another one, April 19th, from Solar Power World about hail damage and how to protect your arrays against large hail. That's especially important with the larger utility scale systems. And then there's another one of these Renvu energy storage market systems. This one focuses on a different manufacturer. I'm kind of looking close in there. It's I can't read it from here, but it's another manufacturer. You can probably see it better than I can on April 19th. And then ACES is having a webinar series on the 26th about the growing solar market in South America. So that should be interesting. And as I mentioned before, if you need the links on these, I have kept the emails that notified me of these, but probably an easier way is just Google it yourself and you'll find your way into those, but just to make you aware that they exist and that they're happening. So anybody else have any solar announcements they want to throw out there? Give you just a second. All right, so then I thought trying to come up with a topic here. I thought that there was a recent clarification just issued by the IRS on some of the tax credits that are available. And these clarifications can get a little bit murky. So sorry about that. That's why I keep putting clarification in quotes, because the more you look at these things, the more confused you get. And to be fair, there's a lot of nuances within what they're trying to achieve here. So how do you define it? And, you know, it gets very complicated. So the one that just was released, oh, before I get into that, there is a nice resource here, and I put the link there. It's questrenewables.com /IRA-resources-4-solar-stakeholders. So questrenewables.com, and then they've got a nice page in there, IRA resources for solar stakeholders. And they've got about 178-page book that is the guidelines to the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. So that's available free for download. Then they've got some other documents I've listed there, general summaries on the investment tax credit and the production tax credit. Those are two different ways of getting tacking into these credits. One is based on how much you spent. The other one is based on how much you produce, and which one you decide to take advantage of is really dependent upon the system that you're installing and how much it costs to install it. Then there's some guidance for their loan programs. And then there's some legislative analysis based on county data that's available. And then you can also sign up to get ongoing updates from this particular website on IRA information.
Hey, Jay, can I ask a quick question?
You sure can.
Thank you. So tax credits, do you know if tax credits kind of work like how Tesla was able to go and sell their credits? Like, are they only to the buyer, or, like if you're, you lease it to a customer, then do you get to keep the credits? Are they transferable? How does that work?
Yeah. Yeah, that's, I guess we're getting immediately into why it gets a little bit complicated. Essentially, if a homeowner or a business owner pays for their own system, clearly they own the tax credits. Now they can take advantage of those, deducting on their taxes. But oftentimes they will sell, the IRA will allow them to then sell those tax credits to other investors. So for example, let's say that you need the money up front to help pay for the system itself. Many times a large system, let's say you've got $1 million in tax credits, they might then sell that on the secondary market as an investment to somebody else. But it would have to be at a discount. So at that point, they might sell it for 75 cents on the dollar. So they are transferable in that regard. Typically, when you lease a system, you don't own it. So the owner is the one who's going to take advantage of those tax credits. They might sell them to somebody else or do it. Those things can always be negotiated, though, I guess. It would be a matter for lawyers and contractors and accountants.
So does this IRA speak to how you identify a tax credit if it was transferred from one person to another, or how that works?
How that works? Well, not really. The IRA doesn't, but the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, is in the process of setting up these guidelines and making these announcements on how all of that is going to work. I haven't seen anything on the transferability of tax credits. I suspect that's kind of a matter of business and accountancy law, already, something I'm not really familiar with. But most of the time, if somebody's going to sell tax credits or the like, you're talking about big investors. You're not talking about residential level home ownership or anything like that. So unless you're playing with the big boys, it's probably not.
And that's kind of a gripe I have too. Is it seems like things are not even if you're small. Like for instance, even like the efficiency, like discounts and credits, right? Um, they're oftentimes written only for the homeowner. So if you're a landlord, for instance, right, you can't take advantage of those savings on your properties.
Oh yeah. Well, I was gonna say, Eric, you're just finding out that things aren't exactly fair for the little guy. But no, if you're a landlord and you pay for the investment of the solar panels on your properties, you own those tax credits. And in fact, those are considered commercial activity and maybe then eligible for some of these additional add-ons. A residential system only is eligible for the 30% tax credit that's available to everybody. Perhaps, and this is still unclear, you might be eligible for the 10% domestic content tax credit. But when you talk about energy community tax credits and what are some low-income housing tax credits, those are built into it. So as a landlord, you might be eligible for those additionally, but of course you have to then pay for the system to install it.
Good to know. Thank you.
All right. Now also, and I'll get into this at the tail end of this presentation, but as a landlord on those kind of properties, you may also be eligible for USDA REAP grants. And there have been some added incentives just put into that program as well. So I'll mention that at the tail end. So the guidance that was just issued this week was about energy communities, and that particular terminology has been a little bit confusing. What constitutes an energy community? And I think of this as the Joe Manchin provision, because he basically, I'm sure in these negotiations said, listen, you're going to take care of West Virginia, otherwise I'm not voting on this thing. So those people that are traditional fossil fuel based economies have to benefit from the transition to the renewable energy world. So what constitutes these energy communities? Well, there's basically three categories. One is brownfields, which I'll touch on. Another is a coal community or fossil fuel based community. And the third one is where there is a mix between employment in fossil fuel as well as a percentage of tax revenues derived from fossil fuel activities within that community. Now that doesn't give you a whole lot of guidance. It's really open to interpretation. So the brownfield site, haven't defined that yet, but the location has, as far as a one that's employment-based and tax revenue-based, has to have about 0.17% or greater unemployment rate, sorry. And then there's or I should say employed in fossil fuel, and 25% or greater of all the tax revenues come from fossil fuel extraction. And it has to have an unemployment rate higher than the national average. That's their guidelines for that particular one. The third one about coal regions, one is that there was a coal mine closed or there was a coal powered plant closed within that census tract or an adjacent census tract. Okay, so what are these locations? Where are they? Well, fortunately, they just announced this website where if you want to find out if your particular region qualifies for this, at that energycommunities.gov/energy community tax credit bonus, that particular website, they do outline the coal communities and they outline the mix for employment and the tax revenue issue. So I went into that website just to find out my particular region here in Southeastern Ohio. You can click on that interactive map and bring it on in. So what this is showing, this is Southeastern Ohio, and it's actually quite interesting. You could go in by tract, by regions. In this case, the brown The dark brown is showing that as far as the coal, that there was a coal mine or power plant shut down within that census tract. And then it has the light brown, which is the adjacent census tracts within that particular region. And it gives a little pop-up dialog box that says, yes, this particular area qualifies because of, and then it'll say either a coal power plant or a coal mine was shut down. When I looked at the one about the employment versus revenue, a lot of those boxes said that data hasn't been entered in yet. So this is still a thing in process. But for example, in this example, it tells me Muskingum County, Ohio does qualify for that 10% bump if you're doing a commercial installation of some sort, not for residential, but it would be for commercial. So that's a nice tool that is available now, and I assume will be hopefully better as they get more and more data in there. Then if you were questioning, is the site in fact a brownfield? Well, what is a brownfield? The EPA defines that as real property that if you tried to develop it, there would be issues because of the presence of some sort of hazardous material or contamination. Typically, these are going to be industrial sites, but an old gas station might qualify or the like. Well, in this case, you got to find, is it in fact designated as a brownfield? And for that, you're going to have to go to your local group, you know, probably your county building office or your state, whoever is in charge of that. The Superfund sites, of course, it would be through the EPA, but you're going to have to do some research to find out if that is in fact considered a brownfield, where that's going to be located.
So there's no overlap with Superfund and brownfields? Those are two separate.
I think there is an overlap there. I think just one is going to be federally administered for sure, the Superfund ones. And if you're gonna try and install solar on a Superfund site, you know, more power to you. I suspect there'll be a lot more hoops you're going to have to jump through, but any brownfield is going to qualify. So essentially, any industrial site that's being reused for solar is going to qualify for that additional 10%. So. But if you happen to locate it on a brownfield in one of those coal regions, you don't get 20%. You just get the 10%. It's one or the other as part of that. Okay, so the EV tax credit, we touched on this last week just a little bit, but I thought I'd raise it up again here just because we're talking about the clarifications. The IRS came out with some confusing clarifications about what qualifies under the IRA's $7,500 for new electric vehicles. They are saying that if they're assembled in North America, they qualify for $3,750 or half of that credit. And then if they used parts that are mined or sourced in North America or our free trade partners, that's another $3,750. So between the two, it's going to be $7,500. And I did see, and I'm going by memory on this, but they apparently, because they didn't have good guidance, the IRS said, okay, the Chevy Bolt will qualify for the full $7,500 up until April 17th. So if you want to run out and buy a Chevy Bolt in the next week, and certain models of Tesla would qualify. But then after the 17th of April, then they go under a whole different world, and they're not going to get the full tax credit, very likely. I don't think anybody's been able to qualify for all of the locally sourced stuff just yet. The other provision is cars over $55,000 and trucks over $80,000 do not qualify for this. So these are trying to get just standard models, not luxury models. And if you as a taxpayer have an income as a single household of over 150,000 or head of household 225, or married filing jointly at 300,000, you don't qualify either. So that's...
Well, who's going to buy the Tesla for that much money?
What's that? You mean who's going to pay?
Yeah, if you don't make 120, you can't afford the Tesla, right?
Well, if you, there are some lower priced electric vehicles for sure. So those would qualify, but basically $300,000 for a married couple, you know, that's certainly within, you know, that's the bottom 99% of the American population. So I think we should see them buying them, but some of the higher priced Teslas, the $125,000 ones, no, I don't think they would, but they're not going to qualify for that. Those aren't going to qualify anyway. I'm not sure all of the new electric vehicles. I do know that the Lightning, you know, had a manufactured resale price or retail price of 40 some thousand. Good luck getting it for that, but that was its manufactured retail price. And maybe that's why they're coming out with low MSRPs, but not selling them for that, because this doesn't say you paid that. This just says that's the price. That's the manufactured standard retail price. So who knows?
All these loopholes.
Yeah. Oh, hey, you're welcome to tax law, right? For the domestic content item for the 10%, well, the guidelines have not, to my knowledge, been issued yet. They said there were like 4,000 comments from different companies into this process, so they're going through all of that. The basic rule that was part of the IRA was that 100% of all of the steel product has to be US made. So the rebar, in this case, the foundation piers, all of that kind of thing. Then 40% of all of the other product has to be US made, not just sourced or not just assembled. So that gets into where were the materials mined, how were they constructed, things of that nature. That rises over the next 9 or 10 years to be about 55%. So the goal is to get as much of this domestically controlled and sourced as possible. As I mentioned earlier, we're unsure still if this particular 10% bump in tax credits applies to residential or if it is only for commercial installations. So we'll still wait for some guidance there. And then, as I had mentioned before or earlier, the REAP program, and I did just this week attend a webinar on some of the changes to the REAP program. And REAP stands for Rural Energy for America program, and it's run through the USDA. But as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, they increased the amount of money dramatically that was going into this program. So just as a little bit of background here, the REAP program is designed for agricultural businesses or businesses that are located in rural areas. So those rural areas are any municipality or area that has less than 50,000 people. And they are commercial only. They are not for residential. They did historically give 25% grants. And if approved, because it's a competitive application process, and then they had a loan program too, but I won't touch on the loan program. It's a loan guarantee program. They work with the banks on that. So they announced last year they were increasing it to 40% instead of 25% in anticipation of having all of this money coming into the program. So here are the changes that they announced during the webinars that I thought were significant. One is the application deadlines have been changed. Prior to April of this year, you could apply twice a year. So the deadline was basically March 31st and October 31st. And you met those deadlines. If you missed it, like for example, today, it's April 11th. You would have to wait until the end of October before, I mean, you can apply anytime, but they're not going to start looking at them until after the end of October. Well, now they've changed to a quarterly process. So in this case, there's June 30th, then September 30th, and then 31st, of December and 31st of March. So basically every quarter. So that's good. So that means that the backlog is not going to, you don't have to wait for 6 months. You can wait 3 months at the max before applying. The second big change is they're raising the qualification limit up to 50%. So if you are awarded the grant for this, you would be getting up to 50% of the cost. That includes product, labor, everything. It says the first one, if you meet one of these criteria, well, first one applies to solar. Project is a renewable energy system that produces 0 greenhouse gas emissions. So solar qualifies, wind qualifies. Some of these other carbon capture and things like that, or perhaps landfill gas, that wouldn't qualify so much. If you're in one of those energy communities as defined by that map, you could qualify regardless of how much stuff you emit, if you're on tribal land and the like. So this is big news that the REAP grant, essentially, you can apply quarterly, and that it is up to 50% of the cost. So really, if you're a commercial enterprise looking to install solar, the combination of tax credits and REAP, if you can get the REAP grant, basically free. I mean, 50% grant and up to 50% tax credits. That's amazing. No wonder there's such a backlog. So does anybody have any comments on all of that, or Life the Universe in general? Give you just a second. Yeah, Pete? Yeah.
Okay. Yep, we had to unmute. So we talked last week about utility scale solar being a little over $1 a watt nameplate. It occurred to me that most of these, or at least is my understanding, that most of these have an excess of PV capacity for the stated inverter capacity. That can be a pretty big factor. I think I read somewhere it's almost as high as 2 to 1. So if you could clarify for us, what would be a common over PV ratio? And that the $1 that we talked about last week, that is actually nameplate on the PV, correct? Not inverter output rating for a utility scale site?
Yes, on both. Typically, what you're talking about is the inverter load ratio, where because of the economics of our systems today, solar panels are relatively cheap as opposed to the inverter costs. And there's a phenomenon known as clipping, where if you have a higher level of production from your array than the rating of the inverter, it's more economically clever or more efficient. What is a typical clipping ratio in today's market? It's about 1.3. Getting up to 2 is a little bit. In fact, many times the inverter is going to say, I can receive a panel or an array within this particular range. It's easy to conceive of if you're talking about microinverters with a single panel. So a standard microinverter like an IQ8 might say it's going to produce 300 watts. That's the maximum it can produce. But you can hook it up to a solar panel that has an output rating of anywhere between, say, 250 to 450 watts. So if I hooked up that particular panel, a 450 watt panel, to a 300 watt microinverter, you would be looking at about a 1.5 inverter load ratio.
So
that's a little bit high in
AC
today's
is that,
market.
AC is that, like I calculated the recs from.
Sorry. Okay. Sorry, Joni, you're talking there. I thought you had a question.
I'm sorry.
Okay. So, yeah, so then that's how those things work. Now, the reason for clipping and the reason it's a good thing is all of these ratings are based on standard test conditions, which means 1,000 watts per square meter, 25 degrees Celsius. So we don't experience those conditions very, very often. So you want your array to be a little bit larger than your inverter so that you get more production over more time. Hopefully, Pete, did that make
Yeah.
any sense? I felt like
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
rambling
and
a
it
little
covers
bit.
us for a little haze in the air, dust on the panels. As you say, seldom is it that the cells are at 25 Celsius.
Yeah, and if I were to draw it, I don't want to pull out the whiteboard, but I'll try and draw it with my finger. You know, there's a production curve during the day on a day without sunlight that's just basically a bell curve. And a day without cloud cover, you get a perfect bell curve. Well, if I had a 300-watt panel hooked up to a 300-watt inverter, that bell curve would peak at the peak production. So there'd only be 1 minute at solar noon where my panels are producing as much as my inverter can handle. Whereas if I've got a bigger panel, that curve essentially balloons out at the sides, even though it might be cut off at the top. The side balloon of production is actually more than the part I'm losing when the panel is producing more than the output rating of the inverter.
And
So-
that's for the same dollars spent on inverter plus solar panel.
Well, the
Sorta?
inverter companies will tell you that's the case because they don't care how much you spend on your panels.
Oh.
But, you know, the panel's probably going to cost a little bit more. But not always. I mean, in the residential market, oftentimes you can get some deals where a 350-watt panel might cost the same as a 320-watt panel, just from a different manufacturer, or, you know, it's on sale or whatever.
Okay, sounds good. I'm going to recommend my friend shoot for around 1.3 times as many PV watts as inverter watts.
Yes, that would be a good number. Now it doesn't, there's no exactness about this.
Correct.
So if you end up with the different products that are selected and you're plus or minus 5 or 10%, that's not a big deal. Also, you were asking about the pricing, and yes, the pricing is always based on the DC. That's just how they report it. So it's based on the panel output, not the inverter output.
Okay, sounds good.
Uh-huh. Okay, any other questions out there? All right, give you 1 second. All right, hearing none. Let's call it a day and we'll see you next week. All right, take care. Bye-bye.